Welcome. Today, we're going to explore the relationship between fire and Oregon's forests. Fire has always been a natural part of the forest ecosystem, yet many things have changed in the last 100 years to alter the way fire is affecting our forests. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Who is OFRI? The Oregon Forest Resources Institute was established in 1991 by the Oregon Legislature to help educate Oregonians about our forests and to encourage environmentally sound forest practices among those who own and manage forest land. This presentation is based on the special report Fire in Oregon's Forests, put out by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and based on a larger report, Fire in Oregon's Forests, Risks, Effects, and Treatments by Stephen Fitzgerald at Oregon State University. In this presentation, we'll cover the role of fire both historically and in the modern era, including the scope of fuel buildup, the basics of fire science, and the options forest landowners have to creating more fire-resilient landscapes. Fire has always been a common visitor to our forests, in some forests more than others. West of the Cascades, where the climate is wetter and cooler, fires may have occurred as seldom as every couple of hundred years. Yet east of the Cascades, in forests such as ponderosa pine, fire was a frequent occurrence, burning at a very low intensity every 5 to 25 years. As an introduction to what has changed about fire in our forests, here's a brief video from OFRI's Forest Fact Break series that helps explain the relationship between fire and our forests.
Time for another Forest Fact Break, brought to you by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Today's topic, forest fire. As a kid, we're taught that fire is bad. But in a forest, fires happen all the time. In eastern Oregon, some forests historically burned every 5 to 40 years, and for the most part, that was a good thing. They were usually low-intensity fires that controlled the brush and the pests and gave more room to the strongest trees. But over 100 years ago, we started putting out the fires to protect our forests and our expanding communities. And because of it, all the wood and brush have built up to unnaturally crowded levels. Because of all this extra fuel, fires that would have been small surface fires in the past are now giant destructive fires, wiping out trees, wildlife habitat, and sometimes communities. So, how do we get our forests back to the way they should be? Foresters commonly use 3 tools to limit the severity of fires. They thin forests to remove small, medium, and sick trees, or use machines to chop up brush and small trees. Then they use small, controlled fires. They call this prescribed burning. Forest management tools like these imitate what would have happened if a fire had gone through that forest, but without threatening the forest, the wildlife, our communities, or our atmosphere. And that's the story on forest fire. Check out more Forest Fact Breaks or visit OregonForest.org.
Yay, forests!
Not all fire acts alike. Some fires were historically of very low intensity. Ponderosa pine, the predominant forest type on the east side of Oregon, saw frequent fires with very low intensity. Fires cleared out the brush, grasses, and smaller trees, which resulted in fewer, larger trees and an open, park-like setting. These were rarely lethal fires for the forest because the fire stayed low and burned at lower temperatures, although occasionally large trees were killed in the fires as well. As opposed to a crown fire which burns hot, fast, and is usually considered a stand replacement fire because it kills the majority of the trees in its path. Once a fire gets into the crown, it is more lethal to the trees and significantly harder to fight. Douglas fir forests in western Oregon have seen long intervals between fires, often a few hundred years. Fire doesn't affect these forests very often, but when it does, it is usually a hot, destructive fire, killing vast areas of forest. Individual trees or patches of trees might survive to help reseed the area. A field study dating back to 1850 showed that 42% of North Coast's forests were 200 years old or older. Fires were infrequent, but when they occurred, they changed the forest in a big way. This slide looks at recent fire history. These are U.S. totals. We won't get into the details of this chart, but instead we'll look at the trend of fires in the U.S. Over the past 20 years, fires have been occurring more frequently and have been increasing in severity. Oregon is following a similar trend. We see a noticeable increase in acres burned by fire, and more frequent instance of large catastrophic fires totaling 500,000 acres or more. Why does this seem to be trending upward? The short answer is fuel. For over 100 years now, humans have become very skilled at putting out fires. The drawback is that forests that were dependent on frequent fire to eliminate brush, grasses, and small trees are now overcrowded with small to medium trees. Also, past logging practices favor the larger trees, leaving the small and medium trees which are less fire resilient. A steep reduction in federal timber harvest also plays a role. A hands-off approach to management in many of our federal forests have left an overabundance of fuel. So why don't we just let fires burn as they did in the past? Try telling that to someone who lives near one of these forests. Our values have changed. We first and foremost are trying to protect homes and lives when we choose to fight a fire. Even if we don't live on the forest's edge, we still want to protect our water supply, the wilderness we recreate in, and of course the timber and forest resources that our communities depend on for wood products and jobs. We also mentioned threatened and endangered species. We often think of locking up sensitive areas in order to protect threatened species. But if this results in greater fuel loads and a more intense fire, the fire may end up doing way more damage to the resident population and habitat than forest management would have. Another reason we can't let fires burn as they did in the past is that the forests are different today than they were in the past. A century of fire suppression has left forests overstocked with fuel, which means hotter, more destructive fires. So how does a forest fire behave? Like all fires, it needs three things: fuel, oxygen, and a heat or ignition source. Forest fire behavior, how fast and hot it burns, relies on three factors too: weather, topography, and fuel. Fuels is the common denominator here. Changing the arrangement and amount of fuel can help us change a fire's behavior. The least severe type of fire is a surface fire. These stay low to the ground and burn at much lower temperatures. What escalates the severity and eventually the mortality of the fire is when a surface fire burns up into the tree canopy and becomes a crown fire. These fires cause the most damage. And the key to that occurrence is fuel. Overcrowded, undersized trees in a forest stand, along with downed wood, grasses, and shrubs, make it very easy for a fire to spread quickly from the ground up into the forest canopy. So if forest fuels are the problem, what are some solutions? There are a number of treatments that forest managers can use to limit the effect of fire on a given forest stand. We'll talk about four major ones: thinning, pruning, mowing or mastication, and prescribed fire. Thinning a forest can improve its fire resistance. Removing subordinate trees, the smaller ones, will progressively remove ladder fuels. The larger trees that are left are more fire resistant because they have thicker bark and much higher crowns, which further reduces the potential for fire to climb into the canopy. And larger gaps between trees make it harder for fire to spread. Pruning improves fire resistance by raising the base of tree crowns, reducing the opportunity for fire to climb into the forest canopy where it can burn hotter and more quickly. This works well on smaller trees in young forests. Mechanical treatments can also help. Mowing and mastication, as an example, can grind small trees and shrubs into smaller pieces that will decay quickly into the forest floor. The last treatment is prescribed fire. This is not as welcome to many landowners because you are inviting a certain level of risk into your forest. Prescribed fire works best if it is used after other treatments of fuels reduction. You don't choose a prescriptive burn as your first treatment. Instead, after a thinning, a pruning, and a mowing have taken place, and all of the slash and brush have been removed, then prescribed fire becomes a handy tool that you can use for periodic maintenance on your forest. Applying fuels reduction is especially important if you live in a forested area. You need to establish a defensible space, and that amount of space is different depending on what type of forest you're living in. In this example, the defensible space is 100 feet around the home. Removing shrubs, making sure no trees touch or overhang the house, moving any flammable material and plants away from the house, and choosing fire-resistant materials such as composite decking and a metal roof all help increase the fire resiliency of your property. So what have we learned? Oregon's forests are at a growing risk of uncharacteristic intense wildfires. Modification of fuels can alter fire behavior and fire intensity. Elimination of fire from the ecosystem is not the goal. Reducing fire intensity to more historic norms allows forests to survive relatively intact and reduces impacts to other values. Fire scientists are helping us design fuel reduction and post-fire restoration treatments. Not all forests need treatment, but the forests that historically experienced frequent fire do. This ends up including a large portion of our east side federal forests. And to reduce large, uncharacteristic wildfires, treatments must be at the landscape level of thousands of acres. But we need to find a balance between the treatment of a forest and protecting the other resource values that come from that forest. And finally, this is expensive work. In order for this to be accomplished successfully, there will likely need to be a combination of commercial thinning and tax dollar allocations. But consider this. The cost of fighting fire in Oregon's forests is 45% more than performing fuels reduction treatments on that same amount of forest land. In the case of Oregon's most catastrophic fires, firefighting costs were almost 1,000% more than treating the same number of acres burned. So the question isn't, how much will this cost? The question is, can we afford not to? To find out more, please visit the Oregon Forest Resources Institute website, oregonforests.org.